Good day. I'm sorry that I'm pre-recording instead of meeting the class because I was asked to go to an emergency meeting with the armed forces. So I'll just pre-record the lessons for today. At least for modern philosophy. I wasn't able to do so already for ancient philosophy. And this is where we ended up last time. We were looking at primary and secondary qualities in the Berkeleyan sense. Now I'd like us to reflect on the Mite's foot. No? So to undermine Hylas's appeal to primary and secondary qualities, Philonous attacks the objectivity of exemplary primary quality involving the size or extension of a sensible thing. Philonous's strategy is to persuade Hylas that judgments of size are just as subjective and hence just as mind-dependent as judgments of so-called secondary qualities. Philonous describes a tiny insect, a mite, parang pulgas, and its experience of the size of its own foot by contrast with our perception of its size. Philonous further questions Hylas in this way. Besides, he says, it is not only possible but manifest that there actually are animals whose eyes are by nature framed to perceive those things which by reason of their minuteness, smallness, escape our sight. What think you of those inconceivably small animals perceived by glasses? Must we suppose they are all stark blind? Or in case they see, can it be imagined their sight had not the same use in preserving their bodies from injuries, which appears in that of all other animals? And if it hath, is it not evident they must see particles less than their own bodies, which will present them with a far different view in each object from that which strikes our senses? Even our own eyes do not always represent objects to us after the same manner. In the jaundice, everyone knows that all things seem yellow. Is it not therefore highly probable those animals in whose eyes we discern a very different texture from that of ours, and whose bodies abound with different humors, do not see the same colors in every object that we do? From all which, should it not seem to follow that all colors are equally apparent, and that none of those which we perceive are really inherent in any outward object? Hylas would say it should. No, this is page 123. I don't know what happened to my voice, but maybe this is better because Father Venusto is saying napakapalangkera daw ng boses ko last time when I was meeting the class. So I will tone my voice a bit para hindi niya masabing palengkera yung boses ko. Hehehe. So Philonous repeats a common misconception about the experience of colors by persons diseased with yellow jaundice. He says that they perceive everything as though tinged with yellow. Dilawan, lahat. Pag may namatay ka rin ng jaundice, lahat magiging dilaw. The illness causes the whites of the eyes to become yellowed, but there's no evidence to indicate that victims afflicted with the disease see things as though through yellow lenses. The general point Philonous wants to make is nevertheless correct, that by special conditioning, it is possible for different subjects to experience color differently, as we have seen already in the case of color blindness. With variable color perception as the basis for analogy, Philonous now suggests the possibility of variable size or extension perception on the part of human subjects and of tiny creatures like the mite. Hylas agrees that mites have eyes much as we do, and that their vision is used like ours among the ways to help inform them about the state of the world around them, and in particular about potential dangers they need to avoid. Philonous presses the point further in 126. Let's read that here. You are still then of opinion that extension and figures are inherent in external unthinking substances. I am, says Hylas. But what if the same arguments which are brought against secondary qualities will hold good against these also? Why then shall I be obliged to think they too exist only in the mind? Philonous says, is it your opinion, the very figure and extension which you perceive by sense, exist in the outward object or material substance? It is, says Hylas. And then Philonous would say, have all other animals as good grounds to think the same of the figure and extension which they see and feel? Without doubt, if they have any thought at all. Admitting that insects are able to perceive figures and extension of shape and size, much as we do for similar purposes, Hylas opens himself to an obvious objection. Philonous observes that in the case of a mite should be able to perceive its own foot, which to the mite must appear roughly as large to it as our feet do to us. The mite's foot, as the mite experiences it, is relatively large, while the mite's foot, as we perceived it, is minuscule, barely visible, if visible at all without the aid of a magnifying glass. The difference in subjective sensation, therefore, of the size or extension of the mite's foot as we see it and as the mite sees it, thus just as variable in the case of the supposedly primary quality, as Hylas and Philonous have already admitted, with respect to the subjective experience of secondary qualities such as hot and cold, warm and cool, colors and tastes and smell. Philonous further interrogates Hylas, and it's here in front of you in color blue. Answer me, he says. Think you the senses were bestowed upon all animals for their preservation and well-being in life, or were they given to men alone for this end? I make no question, but they have the same use in all other animals. If so, is it not necessary then, should be enabled by them to perceive their own limbs, and those bodies which are capable of harming them? Certainly. And then here, a mite, therefore, must suppose to see his own foot. Kaya nga mite's foot ang tawag natin sa section nito. And things equal or even less than it as bodies of some considerable dimension, though at the same time they appear to you scarce, discernible, or at best as so many visible points. I cannot deny it. And to creatures less than the mite, they will seem yet larger. They will, in so much that what you can hardly discern will to another extremely minute animal appear as some huge mountain. All these I grant. Can one and the same thing be at the same time in itself or of different dimensions? That would be absurd to imagine, he says. But from what you have laid down, it follows that both the extension by you perceived and that perceived by the mite itself, as likewise all those perceived by lesser animals, are each of them the true extension of the mite's foot. That is to say, by your own principles, you are led into an absurdity. The implication of this exchange is that there is no real distinction between primary and secondary qualities. Both alike are equally subjectively variable and as such equally mind-dependent. After momentarily acknowledging defeat, Hylas thinks again and resorts to another distinction that he believes might still save the materialist thesis, at least with respect to their primary qualities. The further distinction concerns a difference that he makes between absolute and sensible primary qualities. Let's see that in page 130. In yellow. What else? Dilawan tayo. It is just come to my mind, into my head, Philoneus, that I have somewhere heard of a distinction between absolute and sensible extension. Now, though it be acknowledged that great and small, consisting merely in the relation which others extended beings have to the parts of their own bodies, do not really inhere in the substances themselves, yet nothing obliges us to hold the same with regard to absolute extension, which is something abstracted from great and small, from these or that particular magnitude of figure. So likewise, as to motion, swift and slow are altogether relative to the succession of ideas in our own minds, but exist not without the mind, and therefore absolute motion abstracted from them doth not. So the distinction between absolute and sensible primary qualities is the same that we have already considered in connection with the indistinguishable heat and pain experienced in touching a candle flame. There is at least an apparent difference between the subjective way a flame feels and its temperature objectively determined by a thermometer or other scientific instrument, or between subjective qualitative judgment and objective quantitative measurement. The same might now be said in the example of the mite's foot. There is an apparent difference between the subjective way a mite and a human percipient might qualitatively perceive the size of the mite's foot as great or small, and the objective quantitative determination of the size or extension of the mite's foot as determined by a measuring stick. If a human perceiver and the mite were both to look at the scale of distance values on a ruler held alongside the mite's foot, they could equally agree that differences in qualitative judgments of the foot size as great and small aside, that the foot is objectively, quantitatively speaking, of precisely the same size, say so many microns or millimeters or other subunits long. We need only hold up a ruler to the mite's foot. Hylas seems to imply that just as we need only place a thermometer in the candle's flame for the mite and the human perceiver, despite subjective differences in their qualitative experiences of the mite's foot, to agree in their judgment that the foot has a certain definite size, exactly and objectively, quantitatively measurable. And here you will see why he reacts negatively against measurements. Let me pause this a bit, but you'll not feel it actually. So it's crucial for Hylas's purposes in this part of his defense that the distinction between absolute and sensible qualities not be confused with the distinction he has previously tried and failed successfully to apply between existent and perceived heat. Hylas has already admitted that the latter distinction is incompatible with the definition of sensible things as whatever is immediately perceived rather than inferred causes. The distinction between absolute and sensible qualities is different in that an absolute quality, as Hylas indicates in the passage, is supposed to be abstracted from particular sensible qualities or their instantiations in the perceptions of sensible things. Philonuus's objection to the distinction is more general than its use in Hylas's defense of materialism. As an empiricist, Berkeley, much like Aristotle and Sextus Empiricus, is opposed to the existence of any abstract ideas. This is as true of absolute magnitudes of temperature or extension of any other so-called primary quality as it is of any abstract entity. We can consider a dilemma in connection with Philonu's example of the Mite's foot or Berkeley's candle when we imagine putting a thermometer into the candle flame or setting a ruler against the Mite's foot and reading the results. We might interpret the procedure as in several ways. If we consider looking at the scale of on the thermometer or ruler as another perception involving visual or other sense experience, then we are back where we started with respect to the subjective variability of secondary quality. The measuring stick will look bigger to the Mite than to a human observer, and its markings, so differently perceived from its standpoint, are also sure to be differently read and differently judged with respect to the exact size of the Mite's foot. The use of scientific measuring equipment in this sense offers another set of perceptual objects to be evaluated in judging primary qualities, but does not avoid any of the subjectivity that affects determinations of values in the case of secondary qualities. Magkaiba yung sukat sa paan nung pulgas. Kahit na gumamit ka ng ruler, iba yung dating nun sa paa niya kasi nga pulgas lang siya. So if, on the other hand, as the terminology by which Hylas characterizes the distinction strongly suggests, absolute, by contrast with sensible primary qualities, are supposed to be non-sensible, then they can only be so by virtue of involving abstract ideas, abstracted as generalizations from particular sensible primary qualities, in particular, perceptions of sensible things. Philonuus argues against the possibility of absolute primary qualities in this sense, on the ground that there can be no abstract ideas, and that the concept of an abstract idea is unintelligible. Philonuus first challenges Hylas to try to think of an abstract general idea, an idea that has no particular sensible qualities, and is altogether abstracted from a particular application. Let's read this one. These absolute qualities you speak of, therefore, stripped of all sensible properties, are without all specific and numerical differences, as the schools call them. They are. That is to say that extension in general and motion in general. Let it be so. But it is a universally received maxim that everything which exists is particular. How then can motion in general or extension in general exist in any corporeal substance? I will take time to solve your difficulty, he says. But the point may be speedily decided, he says. Without doubt, you can tell whether you are able to frame this or that idea. Now I am content to put our dispute on this issue If you can frame in your thoughts a distinct abstract idea or motion or extension, divested of all those sensible modes as swift and slow, great and small, round and square, and the like, which are acknowledged to exist only in the mind, I will then yield the point you contend for. But if you cannot, it will be unreasonable on your side to insist any longer upon what you have no notion of. And Hylas would say, to confess ingenuously, I cannot. As a last-ditch effort, Hylas suggests that abstract ideas might be entertained by what he proposes to call a pure intellect. Philonous replies that he cannot consider abstract ideas by any faculty, regardless of how they are designated. Thus, Philonous dispenses with the possibility of abstract ideas and thereby Hylas's attempt to defend the distinction between primary and secondary qualities. At the same time, he refutes the concept of abstract ideas generally in mathematics and all areas of science and philosophy. Later, Philonous argues somewhat like Occam that what is called abstract reasoning involves the delegation of particular ideas to stand for a collection of whatever similar particular ideas. He holds that the imagination resists mistaken attempts to draw false generalizations based on the particular properties and peculiarities of a chosen example to represent all other grouped together in the same category. The imagination spontaneously produces counterexamples in such cases to alert us to the fact that our thinking has gone astray. In the meantime, Philonous insists that there are no such things as abstract ideas on which to sustain the distinction between absolute and sensible primary qualities. Let's read that here. 132. Consequently, the very same arguments which you admitted as conclusive against the secondary qualities are without any further application of force against the primary two. Besides, if you will trust your senses, is it not plain all sensible qualities coexist or to them appear as being in the same place? Do they ever represent a motion or figure as being divested of all other visible and tangible qualities? Although Hylas later makes several efforts to resuscitate the possibility of mind-independent matter or the material substratum of sensible things, it is clear at this stage of the dialogue that he has lost. From this point onward, he can only fight a rearguard action against the conclusions Philonous begins to draw from the idealist proposition that sensible things are mere congeries of ideas existing in the mind. And we will now be shifting to a defense to God's existence according to Berkeley. But it's also very important to answer a few questions for me, no? So in the dialogue box below, can you please answer for me one question? And it is this: is there a fundamental metaphysical distinction between primary and secondary qualities? Is there a fundamental metaphysical distinction between primary and secondary properties? Please answer this one in the space provided for you below. And then once you're done, please click next because we start looking at Berkeley's proof for the existence of God. Thank you.